Okay. So I'm Brianna Treleven. I am the executive director of the Shaker Historical Society, and I want to thank you all for joining me this morning to talk about the Shakers in Ohio, particularly in North Union. And I want to thank Historic Zoar Village for inviting us to be a part of their speaker series. So a little bit about us. The Shaker Historical Society is located in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is an inner ring suburb of Cleveland. We were founded in 1947 to preserve and share the heritage of the North Union Shaker community. Over time, we have expanded to include a broader history of Shaker Heights, including Warrensville Township and early city development. And we have goals to kind of expand beyond that as well, to include some more significant history in the 50s through today. And today we operate the museum out of the 1910 Myers Mansion that is in this lovely photograph in the bottom. This house was donated by Frank Myers, a museum trustee, in 1969, and we have been operating the museum out of it since the early 70s. Today, our mission is to inspire people to engage in and celebrate the Shaker Heights story and its impact on the region, past, present, and future. And before I jump into my presentation, I want to acknowledge the Shawnee, Miami, Erie, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose land I stand on and whose land I will be talking about today in the context of the North Union Shakers. And I also want to thank the Lake Erie Native American Council for this information. So let's start at the beginning. Who were the Shakers? Quakers, James and Jane Wardley, lived in England, and they formed their own church in 1747. They held onto Quaker ideas of direct communication with God, individual spiritual experiences, passive resistance, and the inclusion and authority of women in the community's spiritualism. But other than that, they believed in a more expressive form of worship that purged sin from the body. And their movements and trembling during worship led to the name Shaking Quakers or Shakers, which was used as a derisive term by people outside of the faith. The full name of the religion is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. You can understand why we call it the Shakers. It's much easier to say. Because the Wardley Shaker sect gave women equal standing among men, and because Christ made his first appearance as a man, they believed that the second appearance of Christ would manifest through a woman. So then enters Mother Ann Lee in 1758. Ann Lee joined the Wardley's church, as I said, in 1758. She was born in 1736 in England and was forced into marriage at the age of 16. She had 4 pregnancies, but lost all of her children in infancy. And it's believed that these traumatic experiences contributed to her strong convictions of celibacy, abandoning marriage, and pursuing perfection in life. Anne claimed to receive visions and messages from God. And because of this, she was revered by those of the Shaker faith, who saw her as their leader and the embodiment of the second coming of Christ's spirit on earth. But on the other hand, she was persecuted by the established church in England, who viewed these visions she was having as blasphemy. She was jailed several times, and in 1774, she had a revelation that led her and 8 converts to emigrate from England to the United States to establish their religion in peace. So the first Shaker community in the United States was the Watervliet Shaker Village outside of Albany, New York. Mother Ann Lee died in 1784, but Shaker missionaries grew the religion in 11 states. As you can see on this map, most of the Shaker communities were in New England, but they kind of traveled down through Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and even went as far down south as Florida and Georgia. All of these Shaker communities shared some common beliefs. They believed celibacy and confession of sin were the only true ways to salvation. Like the Zoar Society, Shaker villages were utopian communal societies. So everyone shared property and everyone played a role in the village's survival and well-being. They also believed in the duality of God as both male and female. So work, leadership, and spiritual guidance were shared among members regardless of gender or race, although men and women did live and work separately from each other to avoid temptation. They also separated from the world to avoid corrupting influences. And the people outside of the Shaker faith were often referred to as the world's people. And they were famously known as pacifists. So Shaker men were exempted from serving in the Civil War by President Abraham Lincoln. So Shaker missionaries traveled to Ohio after the Second Great Awakening religious revivals in Kentucky in the early 1800s. Again, they believed in celibacy, so they were not a self-populating religious group. They did get a lot of converts through religious revivals when everyone kind of had this rush back to religion and spirituality. There were 4 Shaker communities established in Ohio. The first was Union Village. This one was established by the Shakers Central Ministry in New Lebanon, New York. And then Union Village then became the governing unit for Shaker villages in both Ohio and Kentucky. The next one was Watervliet in Montgomery County, then Whitewater in Hamilton County. And then the last was North Union in Cuyahoga County, which is the community that we focus on in the stories that we share at our museum. I do want to note that Whitewater is the only surviving physical Shaker village in Ohio. So there are no more Shaker members in Ohio, but the physical structures are still there and you can still visit them. And the North Union community was the shortest lived, you might have noticed. It only survived 67 years after disbanding in 1889. And so one of the questions we often get is, why was the North Union Shaker Village so short-lived? But before we get into that, I want to start at the beginning of the area, just in case you aren't familiar with the Connecticut Western Reserve or Cleveland. So in 1796, Moses Cleveland led surveying teams into New Connecticut, which was also known as the Connecticut Western Reserve. They marked township boundaries, and the Connecticut Land Company sold land to settlers. Daniel and Margaret Warren were settlers from New Hampshire who built the first log cabin in their township in 1809. And because they were the first permanent settlers, it was dubbed Warrensville Township. In 1811, Ralph and Elijah Russell came from Connecticut to Warrensville Township to inspect land purchased by their father, Jacob Russell, who was a Revolutionary War veteran. 20 members of the Russell family moved to Ohio in 1812, and then Jacob Russell died in 1821 and was buried on the family farm. That same year, Ralph Russell visited the Union Shaker Village in Warren County and was so excited by the community and the faith that he converted along with members of his family and many of his neighbors. And he originally planned on moving to the Union Village, but he and the other converts were encouraged by Union Village elders to collectively donate their land up in Warrensville Township to start the North Union Shaker Village. There we go. So Union Village elders arrived in Warrensville Township on March 25th, 1822, which marks the beginning of the North Union community. North Union was also called the Valley of God's Pleasure. So if you ever see that referenced, it's referring to the North Union community in present-day Shaker Heights. There was a huge building boom in the early to mid 1820s as they built dwelling places, barns, all of the structures that you would need just for the community to move in and start their services and their worship. In 1826, founder Ralph Russell was superseded by a Union Village elder who arrived to transition converts to a celibate life where men and women lived separately. So 8 days before the final covenant was signed in 1828 by those dedicated to the Shaker faith, Ralph Russell, his wife, and his sons left the North Union community. And there's been some speculation that it could be because they weren't exactly thrilled with the celibate lifestyle and the separation, or because the Union Village ministry had sent an elder to replace Ralph in the leadership role that he had held since the founding. But even after they left, 88 members, including 17 adult members of the Russell family, signed the covenant in 1828. And the covenant was just their way of stating that they believed fully in the Shaker values and agreed to live the Shaker way of life. So as they built their structures, the Shakers cleared much of the land and dammed Doan Brook twice to form two lakes, Lower Lake in 1836 and Upper Lake in 1852. And these lakes were used to power their mills. Their population quickly grew and the community was divided into three families. The Mill or North family oversaw a grist mill and a sawmill that was located at Lower Lake. The Center family governed the colony, managed farming operations, and operated a woolen mill at Horseshoe Lake. And then the East or Gathering family oversaw childcare and education for new converts. In this photograph that's included in this slide is one of the few photographs that we have when the Shakers were still living in the North Union community. And this is at Lower Lake, and you can see some cows in the background, but the gentleman with the white hair towards the right is believed to be one of the few photos of Elder James Prescott. So he was a very influential elder in the community, and this is one of the few photographs of him. So I just wanted to compare these three maps quickly to show how the community grew. So this first map in the corner from 1852, this is Lower Lake in the upper left corner. You can see little squares that are noting the Mill family or North family. And then along the center, more little boxes for the Center family, but the East family structures have not yet been added. And you can see in a couple places, it says H&P trustees. So that was Honey and Prescott. As I mentioned, James Prescott was in the previous photograph, but Honey and Prescott were both elders of the community. And you can also see their names in the 1874 map in the lower right corner. And then I also just wanted to note that in the bottom of the 1852 map, you see D. Warren. Then that was Daniel Warren, who I mentioned, built the log cabin in Warrensville Township, was named after him. In the 1858 map, you still have the North family up in the left corner, and then the Center family in the center. But this time you have the second lake, which is Horseshoe Lake. And then in the 1874 map, you have both lakes, but then in the bottom right corner, you might note that it also says East family and includes some additional squares for structures. And sadly, then the community by 1889 had disbanded. So the Shakers in Cleveland, the 1830s and 1840s were very fruitful years for the North Union community. They built a lot of structures, their industry thrived, and they peaked in 1850 with around 350 members. Accounts from the time describe the North Union Shakers as well-respected neighbors and craftsmen. They were believed to be honest businessmen with finest quality products. And so a lot of the local settlers and residents in Cleveland enjoyed doing business with them. Some of the North Union industries include basket and broom making. They also wove cloth for clothing, yarn, and household needs, such as towels, blankets, and diapers. They made the cloth for all of their clothing in the beginning. Eventually, because of industrialization, it became cheaper to purchase the cloth instead of making it themselves. But when they were really at their peak, they produced much of what they needed in terms of clothing, food, everything like that. They also introduced mulberry trees to raise silkworms and produce silk. And mulberry trees are invasive. And so it's kind of funny that one of the Shakers' lasting legacies in the area is that we are still battling these invasive mulberry trees. And then lastly, they canned hundreds of gallons of fruits and vegetables. And they also allowed visitors to witness religious services. So two of their most notable visitors were James A. Garfield in 1851 and Sojourner Truth in 1856. And I think it's kind of funny that Sojourner Truth indicated that she really enjoyed the Shaker services, but Garfield said he was not that impressed with them. And the North Union community also composed many songs and hymns. So one of the things that people, when they think of the Shakers, it's usually furniture, number one, and number two is their music. And they produce a lot of worship songs in the North Union community, as well as songs to commemorate Mother Ann Lee. And the photograph that's included in this slide is of Shaker's bleaching wool from 1876. And so this was most likely wool that was produced at the woolen mill that was at Horseshoe Lake. So some Shaker customs. Leaders were known as elders or eldresses, and other members were known as brothers or sisters. As I previously mentioned, men and women were separated to avoid temptation. So this included entering through different doorways. They used different staircases. They never touched. And the reason I bring up that last one is because this image on the left in the slide, there's some artistic liberty taken. If you can see, there is a Shaker man and woman dancing, and he has his arm around her waist. That never would have happened. That would have been a big no-no. So we have this painting hanging in our museum, and we note that that was not accurate because they wanted to avoid any kind of temptation. And while men and women both contributed to the community, they did very much do traditional work. So women did sewing, cooking, cleaning, while men tended to work on the farms and in the mills. The children did attend school in addition to doing some work. The Shakers also celebrated Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they wore relatively simple clothing, and their style was relatively simple. That being said, they did use color. So when I started at the museum, I actually didn't know very much about the Shakers, and I kind of had it in my mind that they were very drab people. And I was extremely surprised to see how colorful some of their clothing is. So this cloak that's in the bottom right corner, it's called a Dorothy cloak. It was a standard Shaker sister style that was named after its creator, Eldris Dorothy Ann Durgan, from the Canterbury Shaker community. And as I mentioned, this was a standard style for Shaker women, but it was also very fashionable with the world's people. And Mrs. Grover Cleveland wore a gray Shaker cloak to her husband's second presidential inauguration in 1893. But both that cloak in its vivid red color, and then the walls behind it, that's kind of that vivid blue, I never would have expected with the Shakers, and especially that blue color. This is in one of our galleries that is a reproduction Shaker bedroom. And I kind of thought it was an odd color to pick, again, because I kept thinking like they never would have used a color that was so bright. And then after kind of reading more about the process that went into planning that room, I believe it was in the early 2000s, it turns out that is an accurate Shaker color. And so again, it was surprising to me and to some other people I've talked about when I tell them like that is a Shaker blue and it's so bright, it really stands out. And the one comment we get the most about this cloak is everyone brings up The Handmaid's Tale. If you've ever watched that, that is what it brings to mind. But this was a standard cloak style for Shaker women. And the Shakers were welcoming to all. So that was partly because of their beliefs in gender and racial equality, and also partly out of need since they were not having children. So they built up their populations, again, by taking in religious converts, by taking in orphans, accepting formerly enslaved people. And so some examples from the North Union community include Phoebe Litzel, who was an orphan brought to the North Union community in 1864 by her older siblings who were unable to care for her. Her older sister had a family of her own, and then her older brothers were both fighting in the war. And so they dropped her off at the North Union community, who was happy to take her in. And this photograph of her in the bottom left was taken of her before she entered the Shaker community. So her clothing style is much more opulent than there would have been in the community. At the age of 22, Phoebe decided she wanted to marry a Cleveland business owner. And because the Shakers were not allowed to get married or have children, Phoebe left North Union. But there were no hard feelings from the Shakers. They were a very close community, and the Shaker sisters made her a patchwork quilt that you can see in the upper left corner as a parting gift to show their love for her. And we often get questions because of the Shakers' belief in racial equality about whether there were Black Shakers. And so we do know that there were some African-American Shakers in the North Union Village, although very little is known about them. So we do know that the first Black Shaker was Thomas Jones. He was a former enslaved person who worked as a blacksmith in North Union and was actually brought up from Union Village in Southern Ohio. Emily Jefferson was a member of the Mill family who died at the age of 13 due to an unknown disease. It's kind of interesting that we're undertaking a project in Shaker Heights involving a historic cemetery that also includes a mass grave of Shakers. I'll get to that a little bit later. But we found a stone that was in the ground that said EJ, and the Shaker headstones were very simple. They only had their initials on them. And so it just so happens that based on the roster of Shakers in North Union, that the only EJ is Emily Jefferson. And so we really had no idea that one of the headstones that was in this historic cemetery is from one of the few Black Shakers in the North Union community. So that was a really exciting find that just happened within the last few weeks. And then there were two additional ones that Henry Johnson and Arthur Campbell, we know, were also formerly enslaved persons. And then three Black Shaker sisters that we don't know much about other than their names. And that the list that you see, there are the three names, and Emily Jefferson's name is listed at the bottom there. So Shaker membership around the country began declining in the mid-19th century and really hastened after the Civil War. This was due to a number of reasons. Waning of American religious revivalism led to fewer converts. There was a movement away from rural areas to cities due to industrialization. And then the Shakers were just unable to compete economically with factory-made goods. You might recall I mentioned earlier that at one point, the North Union Shakers even stopped making their own clothes because it was cheaper, or making their own cloth because it was cheaper to buy the cloth to then make their clothes. So the North Union Village population rapidly declined in the 1870s, and the three families ended up consolidating. With aging members and few converts, the North Union community disbanded in 1889, and the remaining Shakers moved to other Ohio communities down south. I also want to note that the North Union community in particular is kind of interesting because there was a lot of mismanagement going on inside. There were several visits required from leadership at Union Village due to some mismanagement, some slight Shaker scandals in terms of some of the leaders ran off to go get married. some minor scandals, but to the Shakers, they were a big deal. And so the North Union community was not really set up to last long in itself, outside of the fact that the Shaker religion in general was kind of declining around 1850 to begin with. The land that the Shakers had lived on was sold to the Shaker Heights Land Company after the community dissolved. Local residents still lived in some of the Shaker buildings once the Shakers moved out, but all of the buildings were eventually torn down due to disrepair or to reuse building materials. So for example, one of the Shaker mills was actually dismantled so the parts could be used to construct businesses in other parts of town, or the machinery was taken to use in other mills in the Cleveland area. The Shaker Heights Land Company donated part of the Shaker's land around the lakes to the city of Cleveland to be used as parks. And today it's collectively referred to as the Shaker Parklands, and the two lakes do still exist, although there is currently kind of some controversy in the Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights area due to the failing nature of one of the dams and the recommendations to remove the dam and revert the lake back to the branches of Doan Brook as it was before the Shakers dammed it. The rest of the land from the Shakers was purchased by Oris Paxton and Mantis James Van Swearingen, who were real estate and railroad magnates who built the Garden City suburb that is now Shaker Heights. And this photograph in this slide is one, again, one of the few photographs of the North Union Village while it was still occupied by the Shakers. So this is from 1876, and this is a 5-story stone grist mill that was located near Lower Lake. This mill had an interesting fate. It was actually blown up in 1886 as part of a 4th of July celebration. So there were a lot of newspaper articles from the time that were advertising this huge 4th of July celebration with tightrope walkers and all kinds of spectacles. And the big event was blowing up this mill. And it was so well built that the first time they tried to blow it up, it didn't really do anything. So they did eventually bring it down. It no longer exists, unfortunately. But it's definitely, it's a weird thing in hindsight. You know, we think, well, I really wish they wouldn't have done that. And at the time, that was something that the community really enjoyed. They liked seeing it get blown up. It brought thousands of people to see it. And it's one of the reasons we don't really have any surviving Shaker structures. So as I mentioned, there are no surviving North Union structures. So I just wanted to kind of briefly share some photographs of the village that were taken by Louis Bouse. So Bouse was a newspaper photographer. He worked for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, who photographed extensively around Northeast Ohio. And he compiled a scrapbook called Shakers in Kirtland that included his photographs of the North Union Shaker community, Warrensville Township, and the Mormon community in Kirtland. And we have this scrapbook in our collection. It's also fully digitized and available on Cleveland Memory. But these photographs by Bouse are some of the only photographs we have of the Shaker buildings. And so it's an extremely valuable resource, even though most of them are after the Shakers have left. It's still nice to kind of just see how the community was set up. And you know what the buildings look like before they were taken down. So the buildings in this photograph are a blacksmith shop on the left and then the woolen mill on the right. So this would have been at the Center family, who, as I mentioned, operated the woolen mill. It also had a cooperage. They made barrels inside. I believe that was maybe on the top floor. And this would have been located at what is now Horseshoe Lake. This is the Shaker Cemetery. This photograph is from 1894. So when the Van Swearingen brothers were developing their perfect garden community, they supposedly got permission from another Shaker community to exhume the bodies from the Shaker Cemetery in the early 1900s. The idea was that once the spirit left the body, there was no significance attached to the body anymore. So many of the bodies were placed in a mass grave in Warrensville West Cemetery. It still exists today. It's the second oldest cemetery in Cuyahoga County. And the Shaker Historical Society is actually working with the Shaker Heights Public Library and the city of Shaker Heights on a master preservation plan to kind of get this cemetery back into visibility. People don't realize it's there. It's in a very weird spot nestled next to a grocery store. But it is now the final resting place for many of the Shakers. That being said, we do know that not all of these Shaker bodies were moved. And so due to the location, it is quite likely that there are some Shaker bodies that are under a road and in someone's front yard in the area that was once the Shaker cemetery. These Shaker headstones, I mentioned earlier, were very simple. They just had the person's initials on them, and the majority of the stones did not get moved to Warrensville West Cemetery. So a couple of them were moved and laid in the ground, but we have one in our collection. There are some that have been found in residents' backyards. We don't know whether there are bodies included with those stones, but there are stones in yards. And then there also were stones that were broken up to use as paving stones and landscaping stones at houses when houses were being developed. There just wasn't very much sentimentality or kind of a sense of preservation regarding these stones. This is a photograph of the interior of the Shaker Meeting House. And the photograph on the left, you can see it's a wide open space that would have been used largely for dancing. So I'm sure you've seen images of Shakers dancing. I shared that one earlier where the guy had scandalously had his arm around the woman's waist. But dance was a huge part of their religious ceremonies. And they truly believed that kind of movement, trembling, shaking is what got sin out of the body. And the photograph on the right shows the visitor benches. So when the world's people would come and watch, they were able to sit in these benches and watch the religious ceremonies. And then this is one of the few photographs that kind of shows a broader view of one of the family dwellings and areas. So this was the Mill family. So moving from left to right, we have some horse barns and a wagon shed, then a spring house. The larger building was the family dwelling, so where all of the members of the Mill family lived, and then the house at the very edge was a cheese house. And this photograph was from 1880. So at this point, the three families had most likely already consolidated. There weren't very many members left in the North Union community, so it was quite likely that a lot of these buildings were abandoned. And 10 years later, there was actually a fire that swept through the Mill family and burned all of the structures down. So what is the Shaker legacy in Cleveland and beyond? So again, there are no surviving North Union structures. All of the buildings that you just saw in photographs, none of those exist. The only remnant is the foundation of the Shaker sawmill, which is it's not easy to get to. It's in a ravine near Lower Lake, and it floods easily. It is continuing to crumble as of right now. There's kind of there's no type of preservation being done, no type of preservation work being done by the cities. The land is shared by both Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights, and they lease it from the city of Cleveland. So it's a very strange, complicated situation at the parks. There aren't many people who know about it, but it's cool to see, but it is the only physical remnant other than the lakes. The North Union community inspired the name Shaker Heights. It's funny how many people, which I don't blame them because I didn't know this, but how many people we have who visit the museum and say, oh, I've lived in Shaker Heights for 9 years and didn't know it was named after a group of people. We had a visitor yesterday who said that. So it did very much get a lot of inspiration. The Van Sweringens got a lot of inspiration from the Shakers from a marketing perspective. So they relied heavily on the idealized notions of the peaceful Shaker village and the humble Shakers. So you can see in this sign that this for sale sign, they use an image of a Shaker woman. They did have a marketing pamphlet that was called Peaceful Shaker Village, but they really wanted to, even though they had no problem destroying all the Shaker structures, they really wanted to cling to that idea of it being a peaceful place to live away from the hustle and bustle of the city. And so as I said, they didn't care about the actual structures, but they cared about the image. By 1916, all Shaker communities in Ohio had ended. But the Shaker image was often used and still is used in marketing around the state. So as I was kind of doing some research for this presentation, I actually found that the Union Village is, even though it no longer exists, there's a new development that is now called Union Village. So it still has kind of that legacy of being areas of peace and community values that I think a lot of developers and marketers really like to take advantage of. As a whole, the Shakers were known as inventors and innovators. So some of their inventions include the flat broom. This was actually surprising to me because it seems like such a simple change, but you can see that difference in the corner, that prior to the flat broom, the brooms were round, which it's not the easiest to use. I've tried using one. And so they made the flat broom. And again, it's such a simple change, but makes it so much more effective. They also invented the apple core and clothespins and the metal pen. And they were really huge innovators with seed packaging and marketing. So they were some of the first to actually, put their seeds in packets. You think you go to a store now, you grab a packet of seeds, and the Shakers were the first ones to do that and to sell them. And they shipped them all over. The seed market wasn't huge in North Union, but they did sell some seeds. The Shakers are also known for their utilitarian design aesthetic. So the photograph that's in the bottom right corner is from an exhibition called Shakers and Movers that was at the Art Institute of Chicago. And people love Shaker furniture. It's highly collectible, but it's endured because of its simplicity. It has simple lines. It's very utilitarian. The peg rail that you see in the background would have been used for a number of things. So you could hang chairs on the peg rail to get them off of the floor. So you could sweep, you could dance, just to kind of get them out of the way. The one that's hanging there now, this little thing is a clothes hanger. They were also hanging candle racks. So the idea was to get as much off of the floor as possible with those. But it's just kind of funny because this simplicity and utilitarianism you see anytime you go to IKEA, and kind of like Danish modern design. It's really carried over into a lot of our lives today, whether we know it or not. The Shaker belief in equality is something that we try to embrace today, along with ideas of equity. But the Shakers really, were some of the first, along with other utopian communities, to kind of embrace everyone. And as I mentioned before, it was partly out of necessity, but also just the fact that they truly believed everyone was worthy of salvation. And the very last thing that I want to note is that we talk about the Shakers in the past tense, rightly, because most of them no longer exist, but there is still one active Shaker community, and that is in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine. If I remember correctly, there are only 2 members of the Shaker faith there, but they still very strongly believe in all of the tenets that I previously mentioned and stick to the old ways of life. And I know that they are looking for converts. So if you have any kind of interest in this lifestyle, get in touch with them, and I'm sure they'd be happy to have you. So that's it for me. That's kind of, again, just a brief overview of Shakers, and particularly the Shaker community that was in Shaker Heights. But does anyone have any questions for me? I'm going to see if I can pull up the chat feature.
Brianna, there were a couple questions in the chat. Someone wanted to know if the lake still existed.
Yeah, so yes and no, in a sense. So both of the lakes, they're still there. The issue that we have been facing is that the dams are failing. So Horseshoe Lake Dam in particular, which is located right across from our museum, it is 169 years old. And the Ohio Department of Natural Resources actually ordered that the lake be drained a few years ago because of how badly failing the dam, the state of the dam was so severe that they were concerned that if there was a breach, that there would be severe loss of life. So the current issue in the Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights communities is that there's a large group of people who want to keep the lake, keep the dam, to preserve this piece of history. But there's also a group that's trying to acknowledge that it's no longer feasible to keep the dam, and that the dam was only as significant as the Shakers were. It's only a small portion of the area's history. So it's an ongoing conversation. Lower Lake still exists. It recently had work done. It was drained. The dam was repaired. It's going to need even more work. Both of the dams were earthen dams with stone spillways. So they were never meant to last forever. They were purely put there for commercial and industrial purposes. Of course, now the lakes have kind of taken on a life bigger than just that with members of the community. And I see information about the Lexington Quaker Cemetery. I don't know about that. I've heard about it. I find it interesting, but I don't know much about that. So I'm sorry about that. Roadways that were named after Shaker members. I'm actually not sure about this. I do want to note that I just started in 2020, so I'm still learning a lot myself. And I'm also new to Shaker Heights. So Carla asked about roadways that were named after Shaker members, and I'm actually not sure if there are, or if there are roadways named after them, who they were named after. Does the Shaker Woods location have any real association with the Shakers in Ohio? I'm not actually sure what the Shaker Woods location is. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that one. I'm not sure. Oh, okay. I see that Lee Road. So Lee Road was, yeah, okay. So Megan just chimed in. Thank you, Megan. Lee Road was actually named for a farmer, so was not named after Mother Ann Lee. That is a very, very common misconception, one that I had as well when I first started. So I don't see anything else coming in. Again, I want to thank Megan Hayes for kind of chiming in there. She's the local history librarian in Shaker Heights, so she's kind of my counterpart. Oh, Jim. Okay, the Shaker Woods festivals. So it's interesting. I don't know of any specific connections, but I do think that it's kind of interesting. They're called the Shaker Woods festivals because, as far as we know, there were no Shaker communities in Columbiana County or in that section of Ohio. So I'm really not sure why they call it that, other than maybe it just being a nod to there being prevalent Shaker communities in Ohio. And I know that they really embrace kind of arts and crafts, and many of which would have been used by the Shakers. But as I said, I've never come across any records of there being a Shaker community in Columbiana County or that area of Ohio.
All right, okay. If there are not any other questions, thank you, Brianna, for the presentation today. Maybe get to see you in person in Zoar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.